To make sure we're linking our videos together, our previous video talked about explicit and implicit memories, and then additionally, information that we process automatically, which we now know is tied to implicit memories. Where we're going to focus our attention next will be on the explicit memory side of things. So we're actually going to shift our attention from automatic processing, which is implicit, to effortful processing, which is explicit. And fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot more to learn with this. So keep in mind that as we continue to explore effortful processing, we're really going to start to dig into that Atkinson-Shiffrin model from our earlier video. So everything that we are about to learn falls under effortful processing and explicit memories. And as a reminder, to the right, we see some of the stages of memory that we learned in the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. So the idea that there's sensory memory, which then potentially goes to short-term memory, which then potentially goes to long-term memory. We're going to focus in right now on sensory memory. So let's look at how sensory memory works. At any given time, there's a bunch of information coming at you. If you consider all of your senses, there's different sights and smells and sounds and all of that stuff going on. So you're constantly being bombarded. And because of our parallel processing and our dual tracks, we don't pay attention to all that. It may be coming in, we may be hearing something. It doesn't mean that we're paying attention to it, okay? So the majority of what comes in when we talk about sensory memory, we say that they are fleeting, meaning they come and they go very, very quickly. So let's focus on the general information at the top. What do we know about sensory memory? Well, we know that Roger Sperry did some experiments, and he found that the actual capacity of sensory memory is maybe 12 or more items. So that's kind of what's coming at you. But most of those things disappear. Okay, you're left with about 3 or 4 things that might enter your consciousness. Now, how does that work? Well, a new term. Using selective attention, we sort of determine what's going to stay in our sensory memory, what we're going to pay attention to. And typically, how we make that decision is kind of using the cocktail party effect. That says that we pay closer attention to personally relevant information. An example would be if you're at a loud party, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot to take in, and you might be focusing your attention on the person that you're talking to. But let's say that across the room, somebody mentions your best friend's name, and all of a sudden you find yourself being like, wait, what? And like turning your head. And the person that you're talking to is like, why aren't you paying attention to me? And you're like, well, I was paying attention to you, but they just mentioned blah, 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 right? So that's called the cocktail party effect. And you guys, that's just the way that our brain works, okay? It can take in all this information and it's not really paying attention to most of it. But if something is personally relevant, it might shift your attention. Okay, so with that said, let's focus on the 2 types of sensory memory. They are iconic and echoic. Iconic is sensory visual memory. And we know that the capacity of visual memory is just a few tenths of a second. So if something is flashed on a screen, okay? Now, George Sperling did an experiment with this, right? He flashed 3 rows of 3 letters on a screen for 1/20th of a second. He actually found that people could remember perfect detail, but it quickly faded. Instead, when he asked them to just focus on a particular row, and he did that using a sound, like a chime, that's when they could recite back all 3 letters that he was asking them to recite back. Okay, so it's there for a second, it fades very quickly. An example of iconic memory in your own life would be if you've ever lit like a sparkler and you try to like write a word with it. Why does it look like a word when the sparkler has already moved, from the top of, maybe your drawing to the bottom of your drawing? It's because that visual lingers just slightly in your iconic memory. You can do the same with a flashlight. The next type of memory would be echoic memory, and that's auditory, meaning sound. Now, our capacity for that is about 3 to 4 seconds. What we know is that we can recall without attention the last few bits of information that made it into our auditory sensory memory. So The best example of this is a teacher calling on you, or a parent or somebody or your boss calling on you. So let's say that you're on your phone and you're looking at, I don't know, your Instagram or whatever, your Snapchat, whatever it is that you're looking at. And a teacher calls on you and says, Sarah, can you tell me the answer to this question? They're trying to catch you off guard, right? But what you're able to do is repeat that question back. So you're able to say, like, well, I'm not really sure what iconic memory is, but I think that it's, right? Like you're able to recite that back. Now, that makes you think that you are paying attention. You aren't paying attention. You can't actually multitask your attention and do anything well. And the reading reinforces that. So, all that means when you're able to kind of do that is that you have a lingering auditory memory for those last few bits of information. It lingers there for about 3 to 4 seconds, and then it disappears if you do nothing with it. So if you're trying to multitask in a classroom and be on your phone while also listening to a lecture or engaging in an activity, you're not doing any one of those things well. So let's move into our next objective. What about short-term and working memory? So we just looked at sensory memory, and we know that there's going to be a few bits of information that we sort of hang on to from sensory memory, and we try to bring them into our short-term. So you can see that image on the right with the purple and the little dots, it kind of shows you that we're filtering out some of that information. So what do we know about short-term and working memory? Well, we know that it holds information for a short duration unless we do something with those pieces of information. So, short-term and working, we've already talked about the distinction between the two in a previous video. So what do we know? We know that the capacity is about 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. The question could be asked that way, or it could ask 5 to 9. Okay, so you really have to know both of those. And it can hold that information for about 20 to 30 seconds with a little bit of rehearsal and without doing anything else with it. Okay. And George Miller is the guy who conducted the experiments that show us this. Okay. We also have Peterson and Peterson who did further experiments with consonant groups. So, what do we know about short-term and working memory? If we look at all the research, we know that, again, 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information can be maintained in sensory memory for about 20 to 30 seconds. But we have to do something with it, meaning we have to use the working memory. We have to use the workspace if we want the information to get from our short-term memory potentially to our long-term memory. So that means we have to pay conscious attention and we have to use strategies. So at this point, can you explain how sensory memory works and describe our short-term and working memory capacity? In our next video, we will finish up with those effortful processing strategies that I just mentioned to try to ensure that information makes it not just into our short-term memory, but potentially into our long-term memory.